Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our very first BookPal Author Chat, Why Storytelling is the Key to Success in Business. BookPal Author Chat is our new webinar series designed to provide quick tips and business wisdom directly from the experts. A little bit of quick housekeeping. If you have any technical questions, please send us a message in the chat box or tweet us at bookpal_US using the hashtag BPAuthorChat. I am Liza, the Account Director at BookPal, and today I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker, Carmine Gallo. Carmine is the author of several best-selling books, including Talk Like TED, the president of Gallo Communications Group, and an expert communications coach and speaker. As a former reporter and anchor for CNN and CBS, Carmine has worked with some of the most dynamic and respected business leaders of our time and gained insight into what makes a great leader. We are very excited to have him here to share with us presentation and communication keys from Talk Like TED and his upcoming book, The Storyteller's Secrets. A little bit of what's to come. We're going to start with an 18-minute presentation by Carmine and a 5-minute Q&A. Feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation. At the end of the webinar, we'll be giving away a copy of Talk Like TED to 3 attendees, so stay till the end to find out if you're a winner. Carmine, we'll let you take it from here.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Liza. And hey, congratulations on BookPal. How long have you been in business at this point? I think it's been 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 10 years. So congratulations, selling large quantities of books to businesses and schools. I've worked with BookPal for years, so congratulations. And thanks. Thanks for inviting me. Everyone should be able to see the slides. Storytelling. That's what we're going to talk about today for the next few minutes. Storytelling is the key to success in business. Storytelling is the key, in my opinion, because stories inform, they illuminate, they inspire. And in my experience, very few business professionals actually do storytelling well. And yet those who do have a major competitive advantage. Vinod Khosla is a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley and someone who I've come to know over the last year or so. He invited me to what's called a Khosla Summit, which is a CEO summit for all of the companies and the leaders who he invests in. And he said something very interesting. It's not enough to have the facts on your side. You have to do storytelling. You have to frame what you're doing in the right context so there's an emotional connection to your story. Now, I spoke at Khosla Summit after I wrote the book that you see on the left-hand side of the screen here, Talk Like TED. This book breaks down the exact methods by which some of the world's greatest TED speakers captivate their audiences. One of the more popular chapters in that book is on the topic of storytelling. All great TED speakers are actually great storytellers. So that's why I believe that today storytelling is a big topic in business, and it's why so many business legends succeed. They credit storytelling for much of their success. And I wanted to study the art and the science of storytelling to better understand why some ideas catch on and why other ideas just don't. So let's talk a little bit more about how to sell your ideas. Richard Branson once said the art of storytelling can be used to drive change. And isn't that what we want? To change the perception that people have about our company or our idea. In fact, what's interesting is Branson so believes in the power of story that he commissioned a local artist to build this fireball pit, that's an actual photograph of it, that's on Necker Island where he lives. And what he and his team do is they gather around the fireball and they tell stories. Because telling a story, according to Richard Branson, is one of the best ways of coming up with new ideas and also of learning about each other and the world. A remarkable thing happens to our brains on stories. When a person hears you tell a story, the same areas of your brain and your listener's brain light up. You are literally in sync. You are on the same page. So now let's talk about the keys. There are, for example, in The Storyteller's Secret, which I just wrote, it features more than 50 TED speakers and business legends and entrepreneurs and famous and not so famous people, but who have all succeeded because of storytelling. So there's actually a lot of keys, but I don't want to overwhelm you. And we just have a short amount of time. I'm going to give you 3 keys that you can use today. in your very next presentation, your very next pitch, your very next conversation, in whatever format you use to pitch or sell an idea. Key number one, above all, is tension and triumph. These are some of the tools that you can use. Tension and triumph. All great stories have tension and triumph, villains and heroes, often in that order. So, for example, why do most of us on this call like movies like Rocky? Why? Because we feel his pain. He's a down on his luck fighter living with a turtle. I think his turtle was the first pet. Remember that before he got the dog? It's the turtle. He's living in this rundown apartment in South Philly. He gets one last shot of redemption against Apollo Creed. Why do we like those kind of stories? There's a lot of science behind that, actually. We are wired to respond to stories of struggle and redemption. Now, Hollywood has known this for years, right? Of course they have. Does it work in business? Yeah, it sure does. Let's go back to Steve Jobs, who I consider the world's most brilliant business storyteller. I have yet to find someone who's better. I've seen many leaders who do things that are similar, but I'm not sure if they have the whole package. Steve Jobs was brilliant at introducing villains and heroes, and he did so in that order. So in 2007, all of you know, he introduced the new iPhone. And people asked, why would we want a phone from Apple? Well, here's why. Steve spent the first 2 or 3 minutes of that presentation showing us the existing categories of phones, showing us the problems with those phones. But if you go back and you watch the video, listen to the words he used. The same words that you would hear in a murder mystery. He called these phones that you see on the screen culprits, suspects, the dark side. Isn't that interesting? It really is just like having dramatic villains and heroes. And then, only after he's exposed the problem, does he introduce the solution, which is obviously the iPhone and all of its features. But remember, it's problem first, solution second. So that's how you incorporate this idea into your business presentations. Let's go to Elon Musk, head of Tesla. So Elon Musk introduces a new product category this summer called the Powerwall. It's you folks have heard about it. It's that home battery that captures stored sunlight and then converts it to energy for the home. This is Elon's very first PowerPoint slide in that particular presentation. Notice it's not about the product. It's about the problem, CO2. Look at the simple words he uses. This is real. The problem, he said, is real. The solution is also real. It's called the sun. It shows up every day. It works. We are going to capture the sun's power and convert it to energy. Those are pretty much the words he used. So do you see how, first of all, he used very simple language, which I'm not going to get into. That's another key. But the point is villain, hero, problem, solution. And here was the solution, which is the Powerwall. So this whole idea of tension and triumph is very important for all of us to incorporate into our pitches or presentations. I love this quote, by the way, which came out from a blogger who was actually at the presentation. Dude, he's referring to Elon Musk. Dude's selling a battery, and he still managed to be inspiring. Isn't that the point? That's the point, is to inspire your audience. And how do you do that? The first key, ask yourself the question, who is my villain and who is my hero? And remember, we ask these questions before we open PowerPoint. For those of you who use PowerPoint or other presentation software, you ask these questions and create the story before you get to that next step. Okay, key number 2 that I think will help you today, personal stories. Stories, anecdotes, experiences that you have had that directly have happened to you that obviously reinforce the theme of your pitch or presentation. So I know that a lot of you have watched and probably enjoy TED Talks. Well, Brian Stevenson, you probably have heard about, gave a wonderful TED Talk that received the longest standing ovation in TED history. Brian Stevenson knows how to persuade. He is a civil rights attorney. His talk, which was We Need to Talk About an Injustice, I believe that was the official title, focuses on people who were unjustly incarcerated. He had a lot of data in his talk, but what was very interesting to me about Stevenson's 18-minute presentation is he told 3 personal stories. One about his grandmother and how she taught him about identity. Second story was about his meeting with Rosa Parks. And the third story was a very simple story about a meeting a janitor during a court appearance who gave him the motivation to keep the fight for social justice alive. 3 personal stories. Here is a breakdown of how Brian Stevenson's public presentation went. 65% of the content fell under what Aristotle, the father of persuasion, 65% fell under pathos, which means emotion, connecting with people emotionally, storytelling. 25% data, and only 10% establishing credibility for what he does. So stories are first. What do most of us do? Most of us spend 99% of our time on the data and no personal stories. Sheryl Sandberg learned this lesson. She's obviously the COO of Facebook. She gave what is now a famous TED Talk that sparked the movement Lean In. In fact, I argue if it wasn't for her TED Talk, you never would have heard of Lean In. But what was interesting is that she has publicly said that when she was creating that talk, it was all data and no personal stories. That morning, before she flew out to the conference, her daughter didn't want her to go. She was screaming and clinging to her leg, and she was saying, "Mommy, Mommy, don't go." And she felt guilty. A friend of Sheryl Sandberg said, "You have to start being more transparent and telling those stories of connecting with women on that level that you have the same challenges as they do." And she was a little reluctant at first. But then she told that story. She started telling more personal stories, and that's what took the video viral. And guess what? What happens after the video goes viral? It launches a best-selling book called Lean In, which translates into the movement. So I think I have a pretty good argument to make that you would never have heard of Lean In, and millions of young women around the world wouldn't be leaning into the workplace, making their voices heard, if it had not been for a very compelling and story-rich presentation that went viral. So always ask yourself, what stories will I share? That's key number 2. Key number 3, for those of you who use PowerPoint, I'm sure many of you do. Let me see a show of hands. Okay, I can see that. Is telling visual stories. If I tell you something verbally, you're going to remember about 10% of what I tell you. And this is pretty backed up in the neuroscience literature. I've seen this several times in different papers. And yes, I read all these really boring papers on neuroscience and persuasion. I don't know why, this is a total aside, I don't know why papers about storytelling don't have personal stories and are really boring. But anyway, that's why I try to make it come alive for you. So here's what the science says. 10%, if I were to just tell you, actually, let's take this webinar, folks. If you were to just listen to me, you would remember maybe 10% of my content. But the fact that I'm showing you images and pictures, retention goes up to 65%. That's why you actually do want to use pictures. But here's the problem with PowerPoint. And it's not just PowerPoint. I think this is with almost any presentation software. It kind of forces you into creating bullet points. So many people love bullet points and sub-bullet points and more bullet points. Pretty much we're really in the weeds. And then, of course, we're not necessarily graphic designers, so people use cheesy clip arts. And because most people are not graphic designers, they don't realize that open space is okay. It's okay to have space. So they add charts and graphs. So they fill every little section of the slide. And then you get something like this. When I created this, I thought to myself, this is the ugliest slide in the world. Would you agree? This is pretty bad, isn't it? Until I saw this slide, which is the ugliest slide in the world. That's actually number 1. So I take it back. I thought I did good, but no, this person taught me on ugly slides. This is a real slide, by the way. You get the idea. When you talk to or when you see presentations by extraordinary speakers like Steve Jobs, or actually Mark Zuckerberg is doing a wonderful job now, and Elon Musk, and many of the TED Talks, What do you see? You see very little text because they're telling a story first. I love this slide from Steve Jobs. I absolutely love this. When he introduced the MacBook Air in 2008, why would you clutter a slide that talks about how thin a computer is when you could just show that it fits inside an envelope? Why would I have any text on that slide? Let me show you another photograph. This is from TED, Chris Hadfield. Chris Hadfield is the singing astronaut. You may have heard of him. He's the guy, he's a Canadian astronaut. He came to fame when he sang David Bowie's Space Oddity while floating weightless in the International Space Station. Do you remember that now? He became a big hit on YouTube. And what I noticed about his presentation, and I talked to him afterwards, is that he delivered 35 PowerPoint slides. 35 slides. No words. No words. Just pictures. Why? Because he said, Carmine, I'm not giving a PowerPoint. I'm telling a story. The PowerPoint complements the story. Think about it that way, folks. I love that piece of advice. PowerPoint complements. Here's a couple of examples, or here's one before and after example. Let's go back to Vinod Khosla. Vinod Khosla said if he doesn't understand a slide in 5 seconds, it's too cluttered. So if you take a look at a slide like this, if you just look at the headline, you could sort of tell that it must have something to do with climate change, global land ocean temperature. There's a lot of noise there. The only thing this slide is telling you is that temperatures are rising. Now, what's a more compelling slide? What's easier to read? What's easier to get in 5 seconds? What I just showed you, the previous slide, or this slide? This is what I mean by telling a more visual story. It's more about the content and less about the clutter that's on the slide. And this is why, getting back to one of my original thoughts, folks, you need to develop the slide or the story first. Let me give you one last example of the power of visual storytelling. Company in Alberta, Canada, who sells industrial equipment. Not exactly the type of thing that would lend itself to visual storytelling. And they were struggling. They were struggling to stand out among bigger companies because everybody pulls from the same labor pool. Everybody sort of abides by the same standards. So what they started to do was present the data differently. Instead of bombarding their prospects with facts and figures, they would put up a slide that looked a little like this. And they would say, for example, in 4 months, we have installed enough pipe into the ground to travel to the moon and back, and we've done so with no accidents. Well, that particular PowerPoint landed them an $875 million contract, biggest contract in the company's history. I'm not going to tell you the name of the company, but I have been in touch with the marketing director. Now, here's the backstory. The CEO, this is just between us on the line here, the CEO hated this. He didn't want to do this. He said, oh, this is too simple, too simple. And the marketing director said, folks, or, Mr. CEO, we have nothing to lose. In fact, we're not doing well. They were not doing well. This was after the 2009 recession. They were really being hammered. And he said, what do we have to lose? I mean, we're not getting that many new contracts anyway from the public presentations we're making. So within 4 times, the 4th time they actually gave this reimagined PowerPoint based on some of my books and based on the content I'm sharing with you today, they scored an $875 million contract. And the client said specifically, your presentation caught our attention. So ask yourself, how will I visualize my story? Finally, let me end with this. We're all storytellers. We all have the ability to inspire people with our gifts. Sometimes people, me, you, folks on the line, we don't always believe in ourselves. You would be amazed at how many great storytellers and communicators did not believe in themselves when they were younger. For example, in my new book, I've got some great stories of Warren Buffett, who suffered a paralyzing fear of public speaking until he took a Dale Carnegie course. There's a pastor on the lower left-hand side, Joel Osteen. Did you know he refused to preach for 17 years until he was forced to step up to the pulpit after his father died? Today he sells out Yankee Stadium. Shark Tank, Barbara Corcoran experienced fear of public speaking. And I know that as a fact because I've interviewed her. She volunteered to teach a college course in real estate. Darren Hardy, who is the head of Success Magazine, said, "I'm not a natural storyteller. I had to work at it." The novelist Robert Stone once said, "Storytelling is not a luxury. It's almost as necessary as bread." The sooner you accept that storytelling is not a luxury, folks, that it's something that we're wired to do, it's something that we have to do to connect to people, the sooner you can get started on the work of shaping your life and your career. Thanks for attending our webinar today, and thanks for BookPal for inviting me. I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh,
Back
thank
to
you,
you, Liza.
Carmine. Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And everyone, we've got some time for some more questions. You want to go ahead and submit some more now? We've got a couple coming in. The first one we have from Mark is, he wants to know what your favorite TED Talk of all time is and why.
Okay, I have, thanks, Mark. I have different TED Talks that I like for different reasons. The one I showed you on Brian Stevenson, I like for storytelling because he is an incredibly persuasive man who I've talked to personally, and he does think about narrative as something that's very important for persuasion to happen, narrative storytelling. And he tells 3 personal stories, and he weaves it in beautifully. And he sounds like he's having a conversation with you. And he actually wins Supreme Court arguments. So he knows how to persuade. I would look at Brian Stevenson, and I also like Ken Robinson. I think most people do. I think he's still the #1 TED Talk out there, Ken Robinson, because of the way he injects humor into a serious topic related to education. Thanks, Mark.
Awesome. Thank you. And we have another question from Jerry that is, can you talk about the process of matching the right story to your thesis or your talk?
Yeah,
your
that's
idea.
yeah. That's actually a really good question because for people like me, I think I'm just a little more naturally inclined to do it. But when I realize why, I spent 15 years as a journalist, so sometimes I have to catch myself. I kind of feel like storytelling comes a little bit more naturally to me. Well, it's because I've studied it for 15 years. But I realize for most people it doesn't. So you know what you need to do is get feedback. Get feedback. Use feedback from a team. Because you may think you've got this great story, but maybe somebody else remembers something that happened to you or a story that you've told that is more reflective of that particular topic. So I would definitely focus on feedback. I get feedback all the time before I give some type of presentation to a group. I'll ask my wife, I'll say, "Gosh, do you remember anything about, this particular topic?" And she goes, "Oh, I really loved that time when we went XYZ and you said this." And I thought, "Oh, that's right. I totally forgot about that. You're right. That would be perfect." So again, sometimes you just have to get out of your own way and get some feedback. A lot of the great TED speakers actually have gotten a lot of feedback as they were preparing for their TED Talk. We just talked about Sheryl Sandberg, right? She came in there with one script already, and she totally threw that out of the water and replaced much of it. So get some feedback.
Awesome. We have a couple of questions keep coming in. We've got time for a couple more. We have a question from Katie that says, "How do you know how much to include your personal story into your talk, and when is it too much information?"
Yeah, that's the problem with personal stories is sometimes it ventures into too much information. Watch Brian Stevenson's. Now that I'm thinking about it, I kind of urge all of you, go watch Brian Stevenson because in 18 minutes he can tell 3 stories. And his stories are maybe not more than a minute. Not more than a minute. Watch Steve Jobs' Stanford graduation commencement. He tells 3 personal stories. Not more than about a minute. So if your personal story, and this is where the danger happens, okay, and I know this is happening a lot because I see it. People get so immersed in their personal story. 5 minutes later, they're still telling their story. They're completely off topic. You don't know where they're going, and your listener's bored to death. So you definitely have to practice at keeping a personal story maybe 45 seconds to a minute and make it completely relevant to your theme. It has to be completely relevant. Otherwise, it's going to be very jarring. You know, whether or not you're spiritual, Joel Osteen does a beautiful job at that. He does that every day, every week in his sermons. He's very, very good at that, and I've talked to him before about storytelling. So he'll pick some very personal stories that have happened to him that relate to the theme. That's what a good homily is all about. Good questions.
All right, we have one more. This one is from David, and it's how do you tell a story with simple pictures to detail-oriented audiences such as CPAs or engineers?
Okay, very good. The one thing I would not, what you just saw from me is not necessarily going to play well with people who want all the details. Not all of your audiences do. However, nobody wants to be bored. And even with engineers and scientists who say they want all of the detail, I would have a balance. I would have a balance. I would show some detailed slides, and then I would show maybe one slide with just one number on it. Let's say there's only one data point that you want to focus on. That's a big deal. Build a story around that data point. Why is that data point so important? Just show the one data point. That at least will break up the presentation so that it's not just all the same exact slide. And don't just assume that just because people are engineers or data folks that's all they want is the data. They want to hear the story behind the data as well. I learned that from Vinod Khosla. Now look, this guy's a billionaire. He receives pitches and sees presentations every day. And he's the one who really kind of pushed me into this whole storytelling channel. Because he said, Carmine, the people who are pitching me, these entrepreneurs, it's all data, data, data. There's no story behind the data. They don't know storytelling. So don't just assume that just because somebody is into, who obviously needs to have the facts, figures, and data, that that's all they want. Facts alone are not enough. Remember what Vinod Khosla said. Facts alone are not enough. You have to do storytelling. So there has to be a blend or a combination. With marketing people, with right brain people, I think you need to go a little further closer to the type of presentation that I delivered.
Awesome. All right. Well, I have one last question.
Yeah.
So I love to talk like TED, especially the portion on stories, and I'm looking forward to the Storyteller's Secret coming out in February. Could you give us a little bit more information about what we can expect from your next book?
Yeah, thanks. You can actually go online to storytellersecret.com. We have some limited information there, but the Storyteller's Secret will come out in February. It's already available for pre-order. Really excited about it because it reveals why some ideas catch on and others don't. I've divided it into 5 sections, short chapters that features famous and not so famous individuals, but all successful individuals who use storytelling to inspire or to educate, to simplify, to motivate, and to launch movements. Short chapters, a lot of famous people who you would know, like Mark Burnett or Sarah Blakely, Tony Robbins, Richard Branson, Steve Jobs, and about 50 others. And then within the chapters, at the end, you sort of get the storyteller's secret, the one nugget that you can learn from their life that you can apply today.
Awesome. Well, we are very excited for it and can't wait for the release in February. And thank you, Carmine. Thank you everyone for attending. If you want to learn more about the book or get multiple copies for your business, you can visit our website or send me an email at liza@book-pal.com. And if you'd like to book Carmine as a speaker for your next event, we've got the information on the screen as well with the email for tom@brightsightgroup.com. We hope you enjoyed your first ever BookPal author chat.